Coming up, Americans and their attitude, promises not kept. What do you do when things just don't work out? Welcome to Living Lafayette, with Lafayette Alliance here in LaGrange, Georgia. I'm Richard Ingram. And there's Tony Privatero right there recording the podcast. I've mentioned to you before that Tony was in the radio business for 40 years, and he wrote a book, and it's worthwhile. Better than digging ditches, except the pay and benefits aren't as good. And it's on Kindle. It's available. Download it. It's a good read. And you can see Tony out at the Little White House out in Warm Springs, Franklin Roosevelt's retreat. And he's a guide there. Here not long ago, we lost an icon in the entertainment industry. Jimmy Buffett died. He was in his mid-70s. There's something I suspect most of you do not know about Jimmy Buffett. You know, he was one of the wealthiest entertainers in the world. His net worth was over $1 billion. He palled around with Warren Buffett. No relationship to my knowledge. Jimmy Buffett was born in Pascagoula, Mississippi. His family moved to Mobile, and he went to Auburn. While he was there, he was in a fraternity, and he wanted to meet girls. So he asked one of his fraternity buddies to teach him how to play the guitar. He learned the basics at least, never got formal training. But he was so interested in girls and his guitar playing that he flunked out after a year. Eventually, he went to the University of Southern Mississippi, and he graduated in 1969. He did not have a degree in business. He did not have a degree in accounting. Jimmy Buffett graduated with a degree in history. It's incredible how well he did, not only in the music, but music business. Everybody loves his Margaritaville, his 1977 breakout hit.
Wasted away again in Margaritaville, searching for my lost shaker song.
And he also was a good writer. Tales from Margaritaville was at the top of the bestseller list, New York Times bestseller list for the longest time. And Buffett enjoyed reading. He would carry books with him when he was out on the road. And one of his favorite writers was E.B. White. White wrote for the New Yorker for years and was the author of Charlotte's Web. I don't know whether Jimmy Buffett knew about Lafayette. Probably not. Lafayette's story is so compelling that surely Buffett would have written a song about it. Jimmy Buffett majored in history. It's a fascinating piece of minutia. Don't forget, go to our website, LafayetteLagrange.org, and you can link up to the podcast there on that main page and shop. Become a member. It's $25. And in addition, get John Beska's book, Trail Tales. There are about 100 tales of Lafayette's farewell tour, and it's incredibly good work. And the stories, the anecdotes, they're shorts, but also in color, and it's worthwhile and inexpensive. John Beska's book, Trail Tales. Lafayette, you recall, had one of the two things now that he really wanted. So we're in 1778, and Lafayette had command of troops. Lafayette wanted to be in the game. He didn't want to be a spectator. He didn't want to have that rank and name only, Major General. He wanted to lead troops in battle. He thought that he could do the deeds, and he was confident about it. So now he was placed in command by Horatio Gates as president of the Board of War, had been placed in command of this incursion to capture Montreal, to capture Canada. So he was to go to Albany, where he would command 2,500 troops and all the resources available for that. He wanted command, and now he had it. You remember he had written Adrian that now he was in this position, and he asked Adrian to share his good fortune with the rest of the family and with their friends. Lafayette was excited. His expectations were high. The second thing that he wanted would be as a consequence of this command, and that is winning the battle and then the accolades, the glory that came, being recognized for doing something worthwhile that had purpose. The two things, command and then execution and glory. Lafayette took off from Valley Forge early on the morning of February the 7th, 5 o'clock in the morning. And he was headed for Albany to take command. It would take him 10 days to get there. About 50 miles outside of Valley Forge, at Ringo's Tavern at Correll's Ferry, right along the Delaware, in what is now New Hope, Bucks County, Pennsylvania, he was to have met William Duer, who was a congressman from New York. When Lafayette arrived, Duer was nowhere in sight. And Colonel Robert Troup was to have paved the way for Lafayette to make it to Albany, making things smooth and attending to logistics. Colonel Troup, nowhere in sight. This was a bad omen. Lafayette, this travel going from Valley Forge to Albany, today it is about 250 miles. Then Lafayette had to navigate snow and ice, and it was 350 miles over those 10 days. So he had a chance to think about things, and he began to have doubts. It's true, this was a winter campaign. Those were unusual. Men would be able to move more quickly, though, across ice and snow, but that assumed that they had snowshoes. It assumed that they had sleighs. And it was cold. They would need hats and coats and blankets. And Lafayette wondered whether they would be there at Albany. And he also knew that he had not gotten the jump start that he'd hoped to get. You recall Thomas Conway was put second in command of this excursion, and Lafayette did not have confidence in Conway. So Lafayette had gone back to York to argue his case with Henry Lawrence and Congress that Thomas Conway needed to be replaced as second in command. He favored Baron de Kalb. So Lafayette had lost time in secrecy. Now, this whole project, everybody in Valley Forge knew about it. Everybody in Albany knew about it. And it was likely the British knew about it too. So Lafayette was beginning to have misgivings. And his best friend, John Lawrence, back at Valley Forge, was not in favor of this incursion, didn't see the point in it. Washington expressed no opinion, said he hadn't been given the details, didn't know what the point of the project was, and he wouldn't render an opinion, except to his friends, close friends. Washington suggested that this was a child of folly. And Benedict Arnold, you remember, had been part of the first effort to capture Quebec back in 1775. Benedict Arnold said that this was a plan that came from designing or ignorant men in Congress, and he didn't favor it. So Lafayette had all these thoughts as he was traveling. And as he was traveling, though, he met America. He became exposed to Americans and their attitude. And he made notes. He was impressed. He said that Americans were simple in their manners, that their manners were Republican. He said that the women were attached to home and hearth and to their children, that the men worked their farms and they would gather to drink and talk politics. He liked them. And one curious comment he made is that men and women married because they liked each other. They were in love. What a novelty. That was something different from the way they did it back home. Lafayette arrived at Poughkeepsie, which is where the New York State now had its capital. And there he met Governor George Clinton, who was governor, and he was impressed with Clinton. And Clinton did everything he could to help booster up resources. Clinton really made no comment about Lafayette's project, about the incursion, except to say that it was curious. He was neither encouraging nor discouraging. And west of Poughkeepsie, Lafayette met James Duane at Livingston Manor. Duane was a Continental Congressman from New York who had been sent back to New York to negotiate with the Indians, to get a treaty with the Indians. The Indians had in general allied with the British, and that had been a problem. Duane was to negotiate a treaty with the Indians. And Lafayette met the first citizen of Albany, Major General Philip Schuyler, who would later become better known as Elizabeth Schuyler's father, Liza, who married Lafayette's best friend, Alexander Hamilton. So Lafayette made this trek, and when he arrived at Albany, his worst fears were realized. Nothing was ready. He had been promised 2,500 troops, half that number, less than half, 1,200 troops were there. There were no slaves. There were no snowshoes. Men did not have the blankets and the coats that they needed. Thomas Conway, who had initially been second in command, and Conway had been back at York and had left York to go to Albany a day before Lafayette arrived. Conway had arrived in Albany and did his best to muster all these resources. But then Conway concluded this was a bust, that nothing was ready. And Conway then he queried the 3 resident generals there about their opinion on whether or not this incursion ought to be pursued. Conway went to Philip Schuyler. Schuyler had been part of the 1775 incursion. And in fact, Schuyler had written a memorandum to Congress suggesting that a winter assault would be prudent. He'd written that several months before, but now Schuyler felt that it was too late in the season, that it was March, springtime was here. He didn't favor it. And Conway also went to Benjamin Lincoln. Benjamin Lincoln had been at the Battle of Saratoga and had his right ankle shattered in that battle. And Benjamin Lincoln, likewise, didn't think it was a good idea to pursue this incursion. And then Conway went to Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold was nursing a left leg wound that he'd gotten at the Battle of Saratoga. Really, the hero of Saratoga, you remember that victory, October 17th, 1777, the hero was really Benedict Arnold, although Horatio Gates was commander and took all the accolades and didn't share those accolades. Benedict Arnold didn't think it was a good idea at all. And Arnold had been boots on the ground back in 1775 with that Quebec incursion. Arnold was forthright. He wouldn't pursue it. So Thomas Conway explained all this to Lafayette, that we need to cancel this. Well, Lafayette's expectations did not receive that well. And besides, Lafayette didn't trust Conway. So Lafayette investigated himself. he found it all to be true. Lafayette went to Benedict Arnold himself, and Arnold started off by saying Horatio Gates is a poltroon and shouldn't be regarded. So Lafayette concluded this was a no-go. All his expectations. Lafayette almost despaired. And keep in mind, it's interesting that it's not as though he had lost a battle, that he had lost a brigade of men. It's just that he had set his expectations up to command this force and to capture Montreal, and now those expectations were devastated. And he was worried about his reputation. What will people think? It was important to him. So the first thing he did was sit down and write France and say it's off. It's not going to happen. And then he had Thomas Conway write out Conway's observations and the fact that, no, this needs to be canceled. Lafayette also wrote out his observations, a little bit more muted, but saying that we need to cancel this incursion. Sent both those letters back to Horatio Gates and the Board of War. We need to call it off. And then Lafayette unburdened himself to two of his best friends, George Washington and Henry Laurens, President of the Continental Congress, and told them that he was just devastated by this. He had such high hopes, and now had come to naught. The mind cannot focus on two things at the same time. So Lafayette got busy, just doing things. First, he had to pay down debts. This Northern Army was $800,000 in debt. Lafayette's whole budget for this incursion was $400,000. So first Lafayette began paying off the small debts, and he paid it out of his own pocket. But he was even then concerned about appearances for the Continental Congress, that if he paid these things out of his own pocket, then the creditors would think that the Continental Congress was bankrupt, and Lafayette didn't want that perception. So he told these creditors, this is money that comes from the Continental Congress, and I deliver it to you. It was Lafayette's money. And Lafayette also permitted his department heads in the Army to buy and purchase goods on his account. I'm sure Lafayette's accountants over in Paris were just thrilled over that. And the Continental Congress decided that all Continental Army officers ought to take a new oath of allegiance. So Lafayette got blank cards from Poughkeepsie, and he did the oath himself, personally. About this time, Baron de Kalb showed up, Major General de Kalb, to take over as second in command, replacing Thomas Conway. And Lafayette was pleased about that. Conway, no doubt, was irritated about it. Philip Schuyler, James Duane, and William Duer had been ordered by Congress to try to negotiate a treaty with the Indians. The lead up to the Battle of Saratoga had found the Indians in a virulent mood. About 3 months before the Battle of Saratoga, Indians had captured, they had abducted an American, Jane McCrae. They had killed her and they had scalped her. This now became a rallying cry for the American Continental Army. And in fact, in 1804, John Vanderlyn painted a remarkable picture called The Death of Jane McCrae. And the Indians were allied with the British. So the Continental Congress, they were anxious to get a treaty with the Indians, and if the Indians would not ally with the Americans, well, maybe they'd be neutral at least. So Philip Schuyler, Duer, and Duane, they were responsible for negotiating with them, and a time for negotiation had been established at Johnstown, New York. The Indians admired the French. That being the case, Philip Schuyler asked Lafayette if he would come along for this conference. Yeah, Lafayette would love to come along. Anything to occupy his mind. But before he left to go on this conference, and incidentally, Thomas Conway was invited likewise. He was nominally a Frenchman, although he was originally Irish. He was invited to come along. But before Lafayette could go with them to this conference at Johnstown, he had received an anonymous letter that there was a plot that the nephew of Governor Guy Carleton, who was the governor of Canada, the British governor of Canada, that Major Carleton was at Schenectady and was fomenting a rebellion, trying to organize Tories, Indians, and blacks to rise up, rebel, and slaughter all the people in Albany. Lafayette took this anonymous letter seriously. He called in everyone that was named in the letter and he questioned them. He could find no evidence to substantiate this plot. On March the 2nd, he traveled to Schenectady. And there, he offered a reward for Major Carleton. And he investigated, since Carleton was said to be in hiding here in Schenectady, to find out what he could about this plot. He could find out no evidence that it was for real. No evidence that there was a conspiracy. And he reported that to Governor Clinton, who was at Poughkeepsie. That same day, then, Lafayette headed for Johnstown. Paralleling the Mohawk River, he was on a sleigh, and he arrived late that night on March the 3rd. He was greeted by hundreds of men, women, children, Native Americans, various stages of undress, he said, painted, feathered, rings, noses and ears. And he got to know them. And he liked them. Of course, Lafayette himself was likable. You remember he smiled. He had a ready smile, and he liked people. He didn't shy away from them. And the Indians sensed that. They liked him. This were the 6 nations of the Iroquois. So going from east to west, there were the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, the Senecas, and in 1722, the Tuscaroras were added. It made 6. Tuscaroras were down in the southeast. So at this conference, there were a lot of Oneidas and Onondagas and Tuscaroras, not many Cayugas or Mohawks, and the Senecas. The Senecas would have nothing to do with it. They were too hostile to even show up. But Lafayette was popular. Lafayette thought that the Indians, they showed common sense, that they were down to earth, that they had a good idea of what for them was important. And they liked him so much that they gave him a name, Keula, great warrior. Philip Schuyler and Duane Endure, they brought trinkets, and they brought some French gold coins, and they brought some rum, and they passed that around. Lafayette mostly had his smile and his joviality, and he was popular. He was most popular amongst them there. They got down to business on March the 9th. Nobody had a lot of confidence in. And on the 11th, Lafayette went back to Albany, and there he waited for orders what to do next. Lafayette now, the humiliation set in again, and he was ready to be busy. This is Living Lafayette. To discover, to inform, to entertain. Till next time.